The rain that fell on the Blackwood estate was a miserable, clinging sort of drizzle. It wasn't a cleansing storm, but a quiet suffocation. It pasted strands of dark hair to Eleanor's cheeks and soaked the thin wool of her travelling cloak, a garment she had acquired in a village whose name she had already forgotten. For 2 years, she had been a collection of forgotten names and borrowed cloaks. Now, she stood before the great iron gates of her own home, a ghost shivering in the damp twilight. Lights blazed from the dining room windows, impossibly warm and golden. A dinner party. The thought was so absurd, so profoundly alien, that a dry, brittle sound escaped her lips. It might have been a laugh or a sob. 2 years ago, she had been the one choosing the menus, approving the seating charts, ensuring the crystal gleamed under the candlelight. 2 years ago, she had been Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood. Now, she was a rumour, a tragedy, a name carved into a marble headstone in the East Garden. The carriage accident had been a thing of violent confusion. The splintering of wood, the scream of horses, the terrifying final lurch into darkness. She had woken up miles away, in a farmer's cottage, her memory a shattered mosaic. It had taken months for the pieces to reassemble, and longer still for her body to obey her commands. The journey back had been a pilgrimage, fueled by a single, desperate hope. Alistair. Her husband. The Duke. He would be waiting. He would be grieving. He would make everything right. But the gossip in the final town before the estate had been a cruel knife. The Duke had mourned his lost Duchess, of course, a year of black crape and solemn duty. And then he had remarried. A pretty young bride from a good family, Lady Isobel. The line of succession, the gossips had whispered, had to be secured. A duke needed an heir. A dead wife was, after all, a dead wife. Her heart, which had hammered with frantic hope for 1,000 miles, settled into a cold, dense lump in her chest. She had imagined their reunion 100 different ways. His shock, his tears, the disbelief turning to joyous relief. She had never once imagined walking up to her own front door to find another woman sitting in her chair, pouring her husband's wine. She had been buried in the East Garden. She remembered the spot, a quiet place under a weeping willow where they had once sat and read poetry. But no one had actually checked. They had found a body, mangled beyond recognition, in the wreckage. They had found her ring on its finger. It was enough. They had held a funeral, erected a monument to her memory, and then, it seemed, they had swept that memory into a dusty corner and moved on. Eleanor pressed a hand against the cold, wet iron of the gate. She could turn around. She could disappear back into the world of forgotten names and become a ghost for good. It would be the easier path. The kinder one, perhaps, but every fibre of her being rebelled. This was her home. That was her husband. This was her life. And it had been stolen from her not by fate, but by assumption. She would not weep. She would not beg. She would not scrabble at the door like a stray. With a resolve that felt as if it were forged in ice, she pushed open the small side gate, its hinges groaning in protest, and began the long walk up the gravel drive. The stones crunched under her worn boots, a sound that was both alien and deeply, achingly familiar. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning. The butler, a man named Peters, who had served the family for 30 years, opened the door. He did not recognize her. He saw only a bedraggled woman standing on the marble steps, dripping water onto the pristine black and white tiles. His expression was one of polite, firm dismissal. "Delivery entrance is at the rear, madam," he said, his voice the same smooth baritone she remembered. Eleanor looked past him into the grand hall. A new runner lay on the stairs, a floral pattern she despised. Her portrait, the one Alistair had commissioned from a celebrated artist, was gone from its place of honor above the fireplace. In its stead hung a landscape, pleasant and utterly impersonal. The air itself felt different, scented with a cloying rosewater perfume instead of her preferred lavender and beeswax. "Peters," she said, her voice raspy from disuse and the cold. "It is I." He squinted, his professional mask faltering for a fraction of a second. He saw the shape of her face, the color of her eyes, the set of her jaw. A flicker of impossible recognition crossed his features, followed instantly by horrified confusion. He looked as if he had seen something unholy. Your Grace?" He whispered, the words catching in his throat. It was a question, not a statement. "I wish to see my husband," Eleanor stated, her voice gaining strength. She stepped past him, over the threshold, and into the light. The warmth of the house was a shock against her chilled skin. She pulled back the hood of her cloak, letting it fall to her shoulders. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, with fine lines around her eyes that had not been there before. But she was unmistakable. The sounds of polite laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted from the dining room. Without waiting for the stunned butler to recover, Eleanor walked toward the sound. Each step was deliberate, a reclaiming of territory. This was her house. These were her floors. She stopped at the threshold of the dining room, a silent spectre framed by the dark, carved wood of the doorway. Lady Isabel sat at the far end of the table, in the Duchess's chair. She was young, barely out of the schoolroom, with pale blonde hair and a delicate porcelain complexion. She was telling a story, her hands gesturing gracefully, a picture of youthful confidence. At the head of the table sat Alistair. He looked older. The silver at his temples had spread, and his face was leaner, carved into harder lines. He was listening to his new wife, a faint, polite smile on his lips that did not reach his eyes. His left hand, resting on the table, had a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. It was a nervous habit he'd had since boyhood, one that only appeared under great stress. Eleanor's presence registered first as a shift in the air, a sudden chill. A guest seated near the door glanced over, his wineglass halting halfway to his lips. His eyes widened. Another followed his gaze. A ripple of silence spread down the table, extinguishing the conversation as it went. Finally, Isabel faltered, her story dying on her lips. She looked toward the door, her brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. And then she saw her. The annoyance melted into confusion, then into a dawning, sickening horror. The color drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. She looked from Eleanor to the portrait of the first Duchess that now hung in the dusty West Gallery, a portrait she passed every day, and the recognition was complete. Alistair turned his head, his movements slow, as if fighting against some immense weight. His gaze met Eleanor's across the length of the room. The polite smile vanished. His face became a mask of stone, utterly unreadable. But the tremor in his left hand worsened, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He did not look joyful. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man watching his own carefully constructed world shatter into a million pieces. The silence that followed was absolute, a thick, heavy thing that fell over the room like a burial shroud. A fork slipped from someone's grasp, clattering against a plate with a sound that was deafeningly loud. Isobel made a small, strangled noise in the back of her throat. Eleanor held her husband's gaze. She offered no explanation, no accusation. She simply stood there, a fact that could not be denied. She had returned from the dead. And her return was not a miracle. It was a complication. The guests were dismissed in a flurry of hushed apologies and horrified whispers. They scurried away like mice fleeing a hawk, leaving a wake of overturned chairs and half-eaten desserts. Eleanor was shown to a guest room, a handsome chamber, but pointedly not the ducal suite she had once shared with Alistair. The choice was a clear message. She was an anomaly, a problem to be contained, not a wife to be welcomed home. Hours later, Alistair came to her. He stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette against the candlelight from the hall. He had shed his dinner jacket and his cravat was loosened. The tremor in his hand was still there, a constant, quiet testament to his turmoil. "Eleanor," he said. Her name sounded foreign on his tongue. "They told me you were dead." "The report was in error," she replied, her voice level. She sat in a chair by the unlit hearth, her posture rigid. She had refused the maid's offer of a sleeping draught, of a warm bath. She would not allow herself any comfort in this house that was no longer hers. "Where have you been?" he asked. The question was flat, devoid of the emotion she had once craved. It was not the plea of a desperate husband, but the inquiry of a man assessing the scale of a disaster. She gave him the abridged version, the crash, the amnesia, the slow, painful recovery in a remote part of the country. The arduous journey home. She watched his face for any sign of softening, for a flicker of the love that had once bound them. She saw nothing but a deepening shadow in his eyes. "The legal ramifications are staggering," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He began to pace, his steps measured and tight. A declaration of death was issued by the Crown. A funeral was held. The entail, my marriage to Isabel, all of it predicated on your passing. Eleanor's blood ran cold. He spoke of entails and legalities, not of her survival. He saw her not as his wife returned, but as a wrench thrown into the gears of his well-ordered life. "And Isobel?" she asked, the name tasting like ash. "She is my wife," he said, the words sharp and definite. He stopped pacing and faced her. "In the eyes of God and the law, she is the Duchess of Blackwood." The finality of his statement struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had survived a wreck that should have killed her, had fought her way back from the edge of oblivion, only to be told she no longer existed. "And what am I?" she whispered. Alistair had no answer. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, not love, but a profound, weary guilt. "This is a delicate situation, Eleanor. It must be handled with discretion. For now, you will remain here. We must think." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the silent, opulent cage of the guest room. She sat in the darkness for a long time, the cold seeping deep into her bones. He had not touched her. He had not offered a single word of comfort. He had treated her like a crisis to be managed. The man she had loved, the man she had crossed a country to find, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a duke burdened by an inconvenient ghost. The days that followed were a form of exquisite torture. Eleanor was a prisoner in her own home, confined to her rooms and a small, walled garden. The household staff was divided. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who had known Eleanor since she was a bride, treated her with a fierce, quiet loyalty, bringing her meals herself and speaking to her in hushed, comforting tones. But the younger staff, those hired by Isobel, looked at her with a mixture of fear and resentment. They saw her as a threat to the new order, a spectre come to disrupt their lives. She caught glimpses of Isobel, a pale, fleeting figure who flitted through the hallways and vanished if Eleanor approached. The girl looked haunted, her youthful bloom vanished, replaced by a pinched anxiety. Once, Eleanor found her in the library, weeping quietly into a handkerchief. Isobel looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "What do you want from us?" Isobel asked, her voice trembling. "There is no place for you here." "This is my home," Eleanor replied, her own voice colder than she intended. "That is my husband. You are the one with no place here. He married me." Isobel cried, jumping to her feet. He stood before a priest and made his vows. "I am his wife. I am the Duchess." The words were a desperate assertion, a shield against the impossible truth standing before her. She fled the room, her sobs echoing in the cavernous space. Eleanor felt no triumph, only a deep, abiding weariness. This was not a battle she had wanted to fight. Alistair remained distant, a fortress of cold civility. He met with lawyers whose carriages came and went at odd hours. He spent his days locked in his study, emerging only for meals he took alone. He was trying to solve the problem of her existence, to find a way to neatly excise her from his life once more. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that he was looking for a settlement. A quiet country house, a generous allowance, and a new name. A way to make her disappear again, this time permanently and with her consent. Determined not to be erased, Eleanor began to explore the house during the quiet hours after midnight. She moved like a phantom through the familiar rooms, cataloguing the changes. Her sheet music had been replaced with hunting journals. Her favorite chaise by the window in the morning room was gone, a stiff, formal settee in its place. It was a systematic dismantling of her life, piece by piece. One night, she found her way to her old writing desk, tucked away in a small upstairs parlor. It was dusty, unused. She ran her fingers over the familiar carved wood, a pang of loss so sharp it made her gasp. On impulse, she tried the drawers. They were empty, save for one. In the very back, overlooked in the purge, was a small porcelain bird, no bigger than her thumb. It was a silly, inexpensive thing she had bought at a country fair on their honeymoon. Alistair had teased her for it, but she had loved its delicate, cheerful form. She closed her hand around it, its smooth, cool surface a tangible link to a past that felt more and more like a dream. He had ordered her life packed away, her portraits removed, her very memory sanitized. But he had missed this. Or, a small, treacherous part of her whispered, he had left it. The thought was a tiny, fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. The spark ignited a new resolve. She was not a ghost to be placated or a problem to be solved. She was the rightful Duchess of Blackwood, and she would not be shunted aside. If Alistair would not fight for her, she would have to find a way to fight for herself. Her passivity fell away, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed determination. She needed leverage. She needed the truth. Her search became more focused. She began to look for the documents pertaining to her own death. Where would Alistair keep such things? Not in the main estate files. This was personal. It would be in his study. The room was his sanctuary, the one place she had not yet dared to venture. She waited until she was certain the entire household was asleep, the silence of the great house pressing in on all sides. The door to his study was unlocked. The room smelled of leather, whiskey, and his unique scent of sandalwood and paper. It was so achingly familiar that she had to pause, her hand on the doorframe, to steady herself. A single candle cast flickering shadows across the walls. His desk was a mess of papers, ledgers, letters, legal briefs. She began to sift through them, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and purpose. She found correspondence from Isobel's father, the Earl of Cranley, his tone growing increasingly strident and demanding. He wanted the situation resolved. He wanted his daughter's position secured. Then she found it. A small, locked rosewood box at the back of a deep drawer. It was a box she had given him years ago to hold his father's signet ring and other keepsakes. She knew where he kept the key, on a small chain he wore around his neck. But she did not need it. The lock was simple, and a letter opener from his desk provided the necessary tool. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside was not what she expected. It was not filled with cold legal papers. It was filled with her dried letters, tied in a ribbon, a lock of her hair, a small, amateurish watercolor she had painted of the lake, and at the very bottom, a small sheaf of official-looking documents. She pulled them out, her hands trembling. The first was the official death certificate. The second was a letter from Dr. Finch, the local physician, dated 3 days after the accident. She scanned the spidery script, her breath catching in her throat. "Your Grace," it began. "Regarding the remains recovered from the carriage, the damage is, as you know, catastrophic, while the signet ring is compelling evidence. I must state for the record that a positive identification is impossible. The body is that of a female of similar height and build. But beyond that, I cannot be certain. The declaration of death must therefore be made on the basis of presumption, not conclusive medical fact. Presumption, not fact." Eleanor sank into the leather chair behind the desk, the letter clutched in her hand. It was all there. The foundation of Alistair's new life, his new marriage, was built on a deliberate choice to accept a presumption as truth. He hadn't been lied to, he had simply chosen not to ask any more questions. He had been so eager to bury her, to bury his grief, that he had sealed an empty coffin and moved on. The door creaked open. Alistair stood there, holding a candle, his face pale and drawn in the flickering light. He had been unable to sleep. He saw her at his desk, the open box, the letter in her hand. His expression crumbled. The fortress was breached. "You knew," she whispered, her voice raw with a pain that eclipsed everything else. "You knew it might not have been me." He didn't deny it. He walked slowly into the room and sank into the chair opposite her. The tremor in his hand was violent now. Shaking the candlestick he placed on the table between them. "At first, I hoped," he said, his voice thick with a grief that sounded 2 years old and utterly fresh. "I paid men to search for miles, for weeks. There was no sign. No one had seen you." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a torment she had never seen before. "The pressure from my family, from the estate, the line needed an heir. My uncle was relentless. He said I was letting my grief destroy the Blackwood legacy. He said I had a duty." His grief, she now understood, was like a sealed room in a vast house, its door locked and the key thrown away. He had not moved on, he had simply walled off the pain. "They brought me Isobel. She was young, suitable, it was a transaction. A duty. I thought I could entomb my heart with you, Eleanor, and just continue. A hollow man, but a duke nonetheless. You buried an empty coffin," she said, the accusation hanging between them. "No," he whispered, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "It was not empty. It was filled with every hope I ever had. I couldn't bear to look at your things, but I couldn't bear to destroy them. I hid them away. I tried to forget your face, the sound of your laughter. Every day for 2 years, I have failed." He was exposed now, all his ducal authority stripped away, leaving only a broken, guilty man. He had not erased her out of coldness, but out of a grief so profound he had chosen to amputate that part of his soul. He had handed her the truth, and with it, all the power. The choice of what to do next was no longer his to make. It was hers. A week later, the key figures were assembled in the grand drawing room. Alistair, pale and silent, Isobel, looking small and terrified, and her father, the Earl of Cranley, a florid, blustering man who clearly believed this meeting was a formality to arrange Eleanor's permanent exile. Alistair's uncle, Lord Harrington, was also present, his face a mask of stern disapproval. They were here to dispose of her. Eleanor entered the room last. She was not dressed as a supplicant. She had instructed Mrs. Gable to find one of her old gowns, a deep emerald velvet that brought out the colour of her eyes. Her hair was properly dressed. She was not the bedraggled wraith who had appeared in the doorway. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she moved with the serene confidence of her station. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice calm and clear, ringing with an authority that silenced the Earl's initial attempt to speak. She did not sit, but stood before the fireplace, forcing them all to look up at her. "There has been a great deal of discussion about my inconvenient reappearance," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, "and the subsequent legal and social difficulties it presents. I believe Lord Cranley is of the opinion that a quiet annulment of my own marriage and a comfortable living far from here would be the most tidy solution." The Earl puffed out his chest. "It is the only sensible path, madam. The Duke has remarried. My daughter is the Duchess now. A scandal must be avoided." "There will be no scandal," Eleanor said smoothly, "because there is no confusion. There is only the truth." She held up the letter from Dr. Finch. "This is a letter from the physician who examined the body found after my accident. In it, he states, for the record, that a positive identification was impossible. He explicitly states that my death was a matter of legal presumption, not medical fact." She let her words sink in. Isobel stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. The Earl's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "A presumption," Eleanor repeated, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "which has been proven incorrect. Therefore, the declaration of my death was an error in law. It is null and void." She paused, letting her gaze rest on Isobel, her expression not triumphant, but matter of fact. "Which means my marriage to the Duke of Blackwood was never legally terminated. It remains valid. The subsequent ceremony he entered into with Lady Isobel, while performed in good faith, is, therefore, legally invalid." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The simple, irrefutable power of her words held the room captive. Alistair sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her, a strange mix of awe and resignation on his face. He had ceded this ground to her, and she was claiming it, not with hysterics or pleas, but with cold, unassailable logic. "I am not a ghost to be exorcised or a problem to be paid off," she declared, her voice resonating with 2 years of pain and resilience. "I am Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood. This is my home, and he is my husband." She had done it. She had taken the decisive act. The outcome of this moment, of all their lives, rested not on Alistair's ducal power or the Earl's blustering, but on the choice she had just made, the choice to claim her life, armed with the truth she had uncovered herself. The room was stunned into silence. The Earl opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. Lord Harrington, the pragmatist, simply stared, calculating the new, undeniable reality. It was Isobel who broke the spell. She looked not at Eleanor, but at Alistair, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking clarity. She had been living with a ghost for a year, married to a man whose heart was buried in the East Garden. Now she understood. A quiet, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sound of release. The fight was over. 6 months later, the gardens of Blackwood were in full bloom. The annulment had been handled with quiet discretion, the Earl of Cranley eager to avoid any public scandal. Isobel had returned to her family, her reputation preserved, and with a generous settlement that Eleanor herself had insisted upon. An act of grace that had surprised everyone, most of all Alistair. The house was slowly breathing again. Eleanor's portrait was back in its rightful place above the grand hall fireplace. Her music was on the pianoforte. The scent of lavender and beeswax had returned. The changes were subtle, but they were a steady reclamation of her life. Her relationship with Alistair was a delicate, fragile thing. They were not the couple they had been. Too much pain and silence lay between them. They occupied separate wings of the manor, meeting for polite dinners and quiet walks. They were like two strangers learning to navigate a shared and treacherous history, searching for a new map. She was standing by the weeping willow in the east garden, her gaze fixed on the patch of earth where her own gravestone had once stood. The marble had been removed, and fresh sod laid over the scar in the land, but she still knew the spot. Alistair approached her, his steps quiet on the soft grass. He stopped beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his presence. He held something out to her on the palm of his hand. It was the small porcelain bird. "I couldn't part with it," he said, his voice quiet. It was the one thing that still felt real. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. The simple touch sent a jolt through her. "I found it," she said. "In the desk." "I know," he replied. "Eleanor, can you ever forgive me? Not for marrying Isobel, that was an act of a desperate, foolish man, but for letting them bury you, for giving up hope." She looked from the bird in her hand to his face. The guilt was still there in his eyes, but it was joined by something else now, something tentative and hopeful. Forgiveness felt too simple a word for the chasm between them. Hope, she discovered, was not a sudden dawn, but a slow, creeping lichen, finding purchase on the barest rock. "You did not give up hope, Alistair," she said softly, her gaze clear and steady. "You buried it. There is a difference. A buried thing can be uncovered." She closed her hand around the porcelain bird, a small, solid weight of proof. Her life was her own, reclaimed not by a husband's decree, but by her own will. She had walked back from her own grave to find her world in ruins, and now she would choose how it was to be rebuilt. "We will begin again," she said. It was not a promise of forgiveness, not yet. It was something far more valuable. It was a choice,